Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts. Welcome to my craft room. We are finally getting to the end of the Scrappy Quilt As You Go herringbone blocks. I've got mine all stitched together into a small quilt. It's probably a little bit of a lap quilt or something for maybe a toddler or a small child. I've gone ahead and I've pin basted. See where I have my little safety pins in? I've pin basted my quilt. I have my backing, and we already have our batting quilted into our blocks, so it's only 2 pieces instead of the normal 3. I've had some requests to show how I go ahead and pin baste it and everything, and I could have taken you out and shown you when I actually did this, but it's down on the kitchen floor and I tend to have my big old butt in the air and my head down, and it gets all hot and sweaty and I'm fighting with the cats. So I thought I would do a smaller version here and just give you kind of an overview on how I pin baste a quilt. Plus, we'll be able to see it in a little confined area better than trying to move around my kitchen. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be like an original quilt because I have my quilt top. I really love the way the Scrappies look up against this navy blue. I have my cotton batting and I have a quilt backing. This is something that my daughter had picked out at one point. She really liked all the different type of Sudoku, crossword, blah, blah, blah puzzles here. I have some blue painter's tape, and then I have my safety pins. These are actually quilter safety pins. I'll show you the difference in a second. But just check out this nice little wooden box. My son Robbie made this for me one time, and I think this one was a Home Depot where the kids could go up once a week and they build a project. He did both Home Depot and Lowe's when he was younger. He loved these little weekend adventure things there. You go up like an hour or 2 on a Saturday. But a quilter safety pin, can you see how it looks bent right there? Normal safety pins are straight, but this is bent so it allows you to dig through the fabric and go from underneath and all the way back up to the top and go ahead and close them. You can do it easily with a straight one. It's just, this one works just a lot easier for when you're trying to go through the quilt because of this bend down here. It allows you to dig through and pop up. Now, I just close it with my fingernails, and I tend to break my nails every time I do this. You can also use a spoon to close them, and they have a special tool. It's kind of like similar to a knitting needle, and it has some ridges in it. So when this goes up through the quilt, you just pop it underneath here, and you can go down like that. Now, if I keep making quilts more and more, I'll probably eventually get one because I'm really tired of breaking my fingernails. When I put these back in my container, I leave them open because as I'm doing my quilt on the kitchen floor, I don't want to have to constantly open these up. They do get a little bit tangled in here, but just a good little shake and they all come undone. Okay, the first step we're going to do is we're going to take our backing and we're going to make this just like a quilt. Because after you baste it, you're going to take it to your sewing machine and stitch it. So you want it to be layered on you can do it on some people can do it on a larger table, and depending on the size of your quilt. I tend to do mine on the kitchen floor. I do not do it on a carpet because a lot of times you can easily pin into the carpet. Some people do it really easily. What you could also do is you can take your cutting mat and slide it underneath your quilt if you have to do it on a carpet. Some people do it on a bed too. There's just so many different ways. But right now, mine's on the kitchen floor or right here on my crafting table. So I start with my backing, and I chose this one so you can easily see that my backing is face down, right side, touching my flat surface. I had gone and pressed this. It probably needs a little bit more. There are some creases and wrinkles. You want your backing to be nice and flat. You want your top to be nice and flat. So if you have to go through and give it a lot of good steam, maybe starch it a little, whatever you need to do is to get it nice and flat, because whatever wrinkles you have here, when you quilt it, those wrinkles are going to stay. And we don't want those wrinkles, right? So I have my backing laid out. Then I take my painter's tape. Painter's tape, because it doesn't really stick to the fabric that much. It sticks just enough to hold it. And you're also not going to have to worry. I don't know about what would happen if you did it on a standard wooden floor. You probably wouldn't want to do that because your pin would constantly be poking into that wood, and when you're going through, you'd probably scratch your wood floor. In that circumstances, maybe you can go to your kids, maybe in their school, in their hallway. You go to a different part of your room. You can go to a church. You can go, a lot of times, like our libraries will let us go and use their big giant tables to put a quilt down to baste it. There's plenty of other options out there for you if you have a nice hardwood floor, because you really don't want to scratch that. I'm doing it on a cutting board, so I can do anything, right? I just take off a little piece. Now, of course, my block is just a little bit bigger than what we can see, but I'll just move my cutting board around so we'll be able to see it. I start out by putting it down in this corner. In the beginning, I don't press my tape down hard because I might have to adjust it a little bit. And I don't use large chunks. Now, even if I were doing a king-size quilt, I might use pieces just a little bit bigger, maybe something about 3 inches, but I would rather put 6 pieces along the edge than to use one long strip. Then I go to the other side. Oh, how easy would this be if it was a king-size quilt to just spin it around like that. Now I'm going to do the center first this time. I just go ahead and stick it to my fabric. And I want to gently just smooth out my backing. I don't want to pull it and stretch it out, because if it's stretched out now, when you take it off the floor, everything's going to shrink back down, and you're still going to end up getting some type of a ripple or a fold or something that'll be a little bit off, and you don't want to mess with any of that bias or anything like that. And if you're doing a larger quilt, chances are you're going to have seams, so you don't want to stretch those seams and pop them open. I do the same thing here. I just gently make sure it's laying smooth and put my tape down. Then my third corner, same thing, a little bit of a gentle, I call it a tug, but it's not anything hard. Then I come over to the other side. Same thing still, just going to press it down onto the fabric. Give it a little bit. Now I can't pull too much because my other side's not taped down yet. At this point, I'm crawling around on my hands and knees on the kitchen floor. We have those big 12-inch tiles with those giant dips down into the grout. It's never fun. It's part of the reason why I've started doing smaller quilts, because I don't have to get down on my hands and knees. All right, now this one we can give it a little gentle pull. Now I don't remember which was top and bottom, but after I'm all done, I usually have to go back. It's this one. I usually have to go back to where I started, and that's why I don't put these down too hard, and just go ahead and pull out any extra, because sometimes you get this little bit of a loose down here, because as you're pulling it out just a little bit, you will get a little extra space here. So I just go ahead and re-tape these. That's one of the good things about the painter's tape. You can release it and put it back down all the time. And then while I'm down on my hands and knees, I just take my roll of tape like this, and I think they call it burnishing it. And I just go ahead and I rub all my spots of tape. Now this small of a quilt, I can get away with just having one on each side and then the 4 corners. But like I said, if it's a larger quilt, I might put 3 on a twin size or even more. My kitchen doesn't handle too much more than a twin. I have to do it in sections otherwise because it's not that big of a kitchen. Next up is my batting. Now you can press your batting if it's a small enough one and it needs to, or you don't have to worry about it. Now I have these little pieces of thread that are just stuck on here, pieces of fabric, because this is a piece of batting from a previous project. So you want to make sure you pick those out because you don't want to stitch them in. And if you have a cat or a dog, you want to pull that fur out too. Check both sides. You would definitely be able to see threads like that coming through on your quilt. Even though I don't have a lot of white or anything on the front side of my quilt, it still could come through. Now of course we already have our batting attached to our quilt, so we only have to check the one side, but you still want to check it to make sure you don't have any stray threads or anything else that could come through your quilt. smooth it all out. Now with the cotton batting, it'll tend to grip the fabric, so now with the batting, we don't have to do anything. Then I place my top down. Now can you see how my backing is a little bit larger than everything? And then I like to have my batting stick out even a little bit further from my quilt top, and then I have my quilt top. As I'm pinning around, I want to make sure that I have enough room, because as I'm quilting free motion or straight lines, sometimes things will move even though they're pinned. Things might stretch a little, and you don't want your top to come over your batting, and then you won't have batting under your top. So you have to plan everything out and start everything a little bit bigger. If I was going for a larger full-size quilt, I would definitely try to put like 5 or 6 inches all the way around on my backing, and then I like to be able to see my backing, and then I can put my batting on top of it. So if my backing was 6 inches, maybe my batting might be 5 inches. Because anytime I'm doing this, I don't want to wonder where my backing is. I want to make sure I have my top right over the backing, and instead of like here, I'm just barely over it here. There's only a 1/4 of an inch or so, and as I'm quilting it, it might shift, and I will lose. I will have my top, my quilt top, I'll have my batting, and there won't be no backing under it. So I try to center everything somewhat. Keep everybody nice and smooth. But for my pinning, what I do as a guideline is I like to pin about, let's see, what is my hand? Yep, my hand's about 4 inches wide, so I like to make sure I put a pin every 4 inches. And that's going to hold my quilt nice and tight, so when I'm moving it through my machine, or I'm taking it and folding it up and putting it away and eventually coming back to it another day because I have to use my machine for some other project, I want to make sure nothing shifts while I'm moving it around my machine or moving it around my craft room. So I do the every 4 inches. While reading blogs in the past, I've seen a lot of the big quilters, they like to do about the same thing every 4 inches, and my hand is always with me, so it's kind of a good guideline. Now with our quilt as you go one, we are going to quilt down each side of the seams where we stitched our blocks together. So I'm going to try to avoid putting my pins in there. Now for a smaller quilt, it's really easy to do that, but if you have a large quilt with different size blocks, or you may have 4 or 5, 6 inch blocks, you might not be able to keep your pins out of your quilting area, especially if you're like free motion. I just remove my pins as I go when I'm quilting. But today, I'm just going to go ahead and put pins wherever I feel it's necessary, and then I will remove them as needed. When I did my big quilt, I'll bring it back in and show you where I put my pins there. So when I'm in my kitchen, I just go ahead and I take a small handful of pins and I just drop them down into the center of my quilt. I always pin baste from the center out. I put some pins in my center square, and then I do a row of pins this way, and this way, and then this way, and this way. So I do the north and south and east and west, and it basically comes out to a cross. I feel that that holds the main integrity of my quilt, and then I pin out to the corners. That way any of the extra fabric I can ease out to the outside. If you were to start at the outside edges and pin in, and if you had any extra of your top fabric, you'd have a big bubble in the center. So that's not going to work when you're quilting it. So you start in the center and you smooth your way out. No matter how you plan on quilting it, when you're pinning it, it's a total different situation. So for a block like this, I would still pin this just to do a little quilting on my machine if I just wanted to make this a little hot pad or something. I tend to, let's see, for this one for instance, maybe I'll just go ahead and I will pin right into the center. Oh, you see I have let me see. I have longer pins and shorter pins. I prefer the shorter pins, but I had already bought the long ones before I realized I prefer the shorter ones. But the long ones are nice when you're going through a seam like this, where all the seams meet in the center of this block. See, so I've just started over at this side, and I went out to this side, and I take my fingernail and I hold this, the pointy end, and I just bring this top piece down and slide it over like that. Now, some people will do all their pinning and then close them all, or some people like me close as you go. I personally have not noticed a difference for myself, so pinning as I go, it works for me. But, you know, try a couple different ways, and whatever works for you is good for you. So then my next thing would be I just kind of put my hand down, and I'd pick another spot, and I'd put my pin in. And as I'm sitting here, it's hard to see, but I'm kind of going through and I'm making sure that I can feel the cutting board underneath so that I know I've gone through all 3 layers. I don't take large chunks because you want to be able to close the pin, and if you take too big of a bite of your fabric and you only have this little bit sticking out, how are you going to close your pin without bunching everything up? So take small bites and then just close it on up. I would say maybe only use up half or less of this distance here. So that gives you, it'll hold a nice amount of fabric and it'll give you the room to be able to go like this. Okay? So then once again, I pop my hand down and I'd pick a spot. I don't always pin right on a seam because, let's face it, it's easier to go through just a piece of your top fabric, your batting, and your backing. Trying to get through the seams, you have the extra fabric in between on your seams where it's, you know, folded over where you pressed it. So it's easier just to go next to them sometimes. If I'm in a certain area that I feel like, say I want to make sure that this lays down nice and flat, I might just use this as a guideline, and just every few of my little rectangles here, I might just go through, smooth it down, and work my way through. You get used to it after a while and you kind of can see the distance of where you need to put it. This one's a little bit under 4 inches, but that's not a crisis. All it means is you're going to have to put more pins in and take more pins out. Now you might want to think it's a good idea to skimp on the pins, but it's not, because that's where you can get the little folds and everything in your back of your quilt, your little pleats and stuff like that, and wrinkles. You really don't want to do that, so it's always a good idea to use as many pins as you can. They're not that expensive. Go to Joann's. Either use the coupon or the things on the tool wall, or whatever they call it, the notions wall. They go on sale a lot, 50% off constantly, sometimes even more. Now when I get down to the corners, I just gently smooth it out. Once again, I'm not pulling and stretching and tugging it. I'm just kind of petting it like I would my cat. Oh, nice, nice. And then I put one in this corner. I like to go on the diagonal of the corner and not like this way. I like to go that way because that's going to hold that down nicely. And it's also because I have this extra fabric here. If I pin that there, there's usually a less chance of this fabric folding under and getting to there. So just go through. I like to make sure I have some pins along the edge. If you were doing, say you were doing a 9 patch, you could put a pin in the center of all of your 9 patches and then just see where you need to put your next pins, because sometimes maybe you have block 1, 2, 3, so you have a pin in the center, and maybe you have to do one right here at the seam and then a pin in the center, and just keep going down like that. Depending on the size of your blocks and how you have it laid out, it's just one of those things that you'll figure out as you're doing it. The most important thing is just to get these pins in so they don't shift. Gently pet it down. Go into the corner the best I can. This keeps my edges, having pins down here, keeps my edges from moving. It holds everything nice and tight. These quilting pins are actually rust proof because they're made specifically for quilting. So while they say you shouldn't leave a quilt pin for very long because you could permanently leave the holes in, or your pins could rust or something like that, it's not that I'm not an advocate for starting a project and leaving it there forever, but sometimes things happen, and I have had it sit for over a year and it's been fine. Sometimes I'll pin baste a project and forgot that I even had it. So then I might just look at my pinning and say, this looks like I might need a little bit more. Depends on how dense you're going to be quilting it and what you're going to be doing and stuff like that. Can also determine how you pin it. They also have these little gadgets that you can take your straight pins, and they have this little foamy piece you put on it like you would for, it's kind of almost like a little mini pool noodle or something. And that way you can still use your straight pins and you don't have to worry about having to close the safety pin all the time. You put your needle through, and then you put this foamy thing on it, and it stops you from getting poked constantly. Because if you use straight pins to baste your quilt, you are going to get stabbed a lot. You don't want to bleed on your quilt, but there is a little trick to get the blood out. If you get blood on your clothing or something, they say you can use peroxide. You have to be careful it's not going to, because peroxide will bleach your clothing. But they said that if it's your own blood, if you use your spit, it will clean your blood off. But a warning, make sure you haven't just eaten like a Hershey's Chocolate Kiss, or if you're the type of person that likes to eat Cheetos while you're quilting. You know who you are. Just because you drink it with a glass of wine does not make it fancy. Then you don't want to use, you want to make sure you rinse your mouth out really well first, because otherwise you're going to get the chocolate or the Cheetos. It'll be in your spit and it'll be on your quilt. So there's your nice little fancy tip and trick, and also a oops, be careful. Because yeah, I was eating a piece of chocolate one day when I'm like, oh, I got blood on my quilt, and I went to get it off and I got chocolate on it. Generally the chocolate will wash out though. Alright, so there you go. It is all pin basted everywhere. I can go ahead and take this to my machine now and quilt it any way I want. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of pins in here, and I do have some of them are a little bit closer than the 4 inches. And for something this small, I probably wouldn't put as many pins in it. But I just wanted to give you an example of what it would look like if it was blown up, and the different places you can put your pins. Now let's see the quilt we're actually working on. When I lay my quilts down on the kitchen floor to go ahead and quilt them, as you walk into my kitchen, you know, I got a refrigerator and a counter, and my stove's over there. So I consider this the bottom of the kitchen and this the top. I actually lay my quilt that this would be the bottom and this would be the top. So if it was a directional quilt, I would be looking right at it the way it's going to lay on a bed. So for me, that meant that I'd have my blocks going this way, the long way. And I went ahead and I just found my center mark. And with this one, we're going to be quilting down on each side of these seam allowances this way. And I'm also going to quilt it along this way. So I tried to keep my pins directly out of that line, if at all possible, because I don't want to have to remove these constantly when I'm doing such a simple quilting. Because this is already quilted to my batting. The basic quilting is done. This is just the extra to hold the back together. So I started by putting a couple pins. I know they're hard to see on all this crazy fabric, but I put a couple pins here. And then I followed this down because it's such a diagonal cut of the fabrics that I followed it down, and I put one down in this corner here and one down in this corner here. And I did that everywhere. I did it straight down here like I said, I did it straight up, and I did it across. Then I came back in and I filled it in the corner quadrants. And I just came back in and I thought, well, for this size block, let me just go ahead and put a third pin in, sort of kind of in the center. It's not like I'm going to actually measure it. It is more than the 4 inches and more than my hand apart. But since this is just to hold the backing on and I'm not going to be doing crazy quilting everywhere, I felt that that would be okay. And then along the edges, I put one just along all the one pin on the side edge of each block all the way around, just to keep the side from folding under it all, to make sure I have it there. Now, since we did these quilt as you go, you won't going to see any extra batting in it, but you do see that I left a little bit of extra fabric around. I did not go crazy because I just did not want to make it super big. But it should be fine because, once again, without doing a lot of free motion or pebble quilting or anything really tight and dense, it shouldn't spread out as much. This is just going to be simple straight line quilting, basically almost like quilting in the ditch. Except I don't quilt in the ditch because I never get into the ditch properly. We're just going to be quilting them lines. I still made sure I had one semi into the corner. And as I said, they're in the edges of the blocks everywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video I'm going to put some stitching lines on here, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome back to my craft room. Now that we've gone ahead and pin basted our Scrappy Quilt As You Go herringbone quilt blocks, blah 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 blah, we can go ahead and get it all quilted. I didn't bother taking you guys over to the machine because basically what I did was I just did some straight line stitching down like this. I'll give you a little bit of a close-up so you can see better what I was talking about. What I basically did is I followed each side of the seam where we put our blocks together. I just went down each side. If you had a twin needle, you can go ahead and stitch both of them at the same time. So I just stitched one side and then I stitched the other, and I also did it on the width side going across that way. So I did it north and south and east and west. I'm going to give you a little close-up so you can see what it looks like. I went ahead and I used a light gray thread, top and bobbin. And when I started, I just took I actually took the sewing machine foot off of my brother and put it on my Singer, because the Singer had this closed in one where you can't see what you're doing, and I really like this so I can see where I'm doing. And it also has the little lines so you can go from, kind of give you guidance of where you're going to stitch, so you can kind of do it the same place all the time. So I just went ahead and went down one side. Here's my seam right here, and I just went ahead and I lined up my foot so that the seam, oh, this is harder than I thought. I put my seam, see the seam right there, and I just lined it up against here on my presser foot. And I used that as my guideline. My needle was right here in the center, and I just went ahead and I stitched all the way down like that. Real easy. Then I went back and I went to the top of the quilt again, and this time I lined it up onto this side and I put my seam there, and I just stitched down it like my sewing machine, and I did that. If you have a presser foot, now would be a really good time to use it. It would help feed all your material through evenly, and you wouldn't get any real bunching or anything like that. After I went ahead and I did both lines of north and south, and I did it across all of the seams, I just went and I did it the same thing sideways. I like how it flattened everything down. It's holding down because I pressed my seams open, so I need to make sure, that's one of the little tips there, is make sure your seams are pressed open really well. Use your steam if you have to. Use one of those little wooden roller things, whatever you need to do to get it nice and flat. Because when you're going over this, you don't want to have any weird lumpy bumpies where possibly this part of the seam flipped over or something like that. And because mine are all nice and flat, you see how I got that nice little flat intersection there? Now remember, I've already quilted through the batting all through here, so when I go ahead and put this in the wash, because I have the cotton batting, I should still get that crinkly feeling to it because it has stitching all over the batting. Stitching on each side of the seam like this will secure it. Let's see what the back looks like. It'll keep the back from, keeps the back from shifting. Now I still have all the pins in it, so I still have a little bit of this free moving fabric back here. You have to remember that in between here, there's nothing here that's been stitched. All this is just the backing floating around like this. But I have it, this is 6-inch blocks. They were 6.5 when we started, so there's 6 inches through here that doesn't have any stitching. Now it's not going to affect anything with the batting because the batting has been stitched. I mean, it's been stitched every 1.5 inches, every 3 inches. There's a lot of stitching in it, so it's going to keep the batting from bunching up, and there shouldn't be really any problem with this bit of a loose fabric here floating around. If that's something that bothers you, you could, I mean, it's going to defeat the purpose of why we're doing Quilt As You Go, but you could put, maybe you might want to put a zigzag that just kind of goes in the middle of the block like that. But once again, like I said, this is the way the technique works, so they're telling me it's going to be fine, that this is how you can do Quilt As You Go, and the people that use this make many quilts and there's no problems, so I'm not really worried about it. We're going to see how this works up after I get my binding on. You'll see it in a future Whip It Wednesday. And then we'll see how, when I wash it, I get the pins out and get it all washed. We'll see how this works. Maybe with everything in the batting that crinkles up, it'll make this a little firmer. But either way, it's going to be fine. It's got plenty of quilting in it to hold it all together. You can see my nice intersection through there. This does have a little bit of a, you know, it's got those little bit pleats or something in it. It's not folded or anything. It's just like wrinkled or something. See how it comes right back out? So I think once it's washed, or I can iron it again, that'll come out. It's just because when I stitched it, I stitched north to south and north to south, so you get that. If you did north to south and south to north, top to bottom, bottom to top, then you would alleviate that problem there. I was trying to do it so that it would be easiest to get it through my machine without having to have much bunched on the side, because I have a really narrow throat plate to work with now. But that's what Quilt As You Go does for you. It allows you to make a larger quilt in a smaller machine and without having all that extra strain on your shoulders or anything like that. Now, as you can see, because I pieced my backing, that some of it's not square on my quilt. There's my quilting lines that are straight, and it's really narrow here, and it gets wider up there. But that's going to be perfectly okay, because once I trim it all up, it's going to be squared off of the center anyway. Things will work out fine. It's a scrappy back and a scrappy front. This is the type of quilt that you want your kids or your grandkids to actually play with, to let the dog lay on it, to run around in the backyard, to use it as a blanket fort or a quilt fort, if you want to call it that. I have extra threads on it. These quilts are meant to be used because we're using our scrap fabrics. People aren't going to be, I always say that, use up your scrap fabrics like this and people won't be afraid to use them. I hope you guys have really enjoyed this series. I had a lot of fun making these blocks. I'm going to be starting on a log cabin one next. I haven't decided if I want to do it as a quilt as you go like this, or if I want to actually make it into a full-size quilt. Well, I've got a whole week to decide, right? If you're curious about how to bind a quilt, if you're not familiar with binding one, if you search on my YouTube channel, I have several videos where I've talked about different ways of binding quilts and how I do them. I show you machine sewing, I believe, and hand sewing. I'm going to try to find a few of them myself and put them up there in the iCard if I can remember. But if you just when you go to a person's YouTube channel, if you search RsIslandCrafts and go to my main channel that only shows my videos, I don't believe you can find it when you're on your cell phone. I know I can find it on my computer, but here's up top of my video, my page, there's a whole bunch of pictures and it says my name. If you look right around here somewhere, there's a little magnifying glass with a search feature. You can just type in anything you want. So if you're on my actual YouTube channel, just type in the word binding, and any video that I've tagged with the word binding or discussed binding will show up in the list. And then you can just go ahead and pick and choose which ones you like. That features on anyone's YouTube channel, so anytime you go to someone's channel, if you want to look up something specific that they have, just do the little search feature, because after a while we get tons of videos, and even if we use the playlist, things will get really difficult and time consuming to find. So I love it when I learned about that little search feature. It saved me so much time. So yes, you'll find all that kind of information there about how to bind a quilt. So until our next video, you guys have a great time, and I hope you really have fun making quilts like this. Don't forget to put them in our Facebook group or tag me on Instagram, or you can always send me a picture down in my email down in the description, RsIslandCrafts@gmail.com. And until next time, you guys have a great week. Bye.